Welcome back to Malden's Revolution. I'm Mark Lenehan. 250 years ago today, on April 20th, 1776, Colonel William Bond of the 25th Continental Regiment writes a letter to his wife, Lucy, from the city of New York, informing her that he and his regiment, including the numerous men of Malden under his command, were in decent health and were today marching to their next mission, reinforcing the stalled invasion of Quebec. Colonel Bond has now been in command of Malden's regiment for 10 months, ever since Colonel Thomas Gardner was mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. In fact, so many of Gardner's regiment were wounded at Bunker Hill that one of the first orders Colonel Bond received as commander of the regiment was from General Artemus Ward, who ordered, quote, that Lieutenant Colonel Bond occupy one room in the southeast corner of Colonel Vassal's house, upon the second floor, for the sick belonging to said regiment. Now, if this house in Cambridge that Colonel Bond was ordered to occupy looks familiar, it's because a month later, General George Washington chose Colonel Vassal's house as his headquarters, and this house, now called the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, is a National Historic Site. And right there is the southeast corner of the second floor. According to historian J.L. Bell, it is possible that this is where Colonel Gardner died. The war is now officially a year old, and while Malden has spent every day of the last year within a few miles of both the British Army and Navy during the Siege of Boston, the Continental Congress has been committing a tremendous amount of resources to invading what they called Canada, but was more accurately the province of Quebec. In fact, Congress had authorized a potential invasion of Quebec only 13 days after they had authorized the Continental Army. Because Quebec had only been part of British Canada since 1763, Congress believed that the French-speaking population of Quebec would view the Americans as liberators and rise up against the British. Like we covered in our March 17th episode, several regiments were preparing to leave for New York before the Siege of Boston was even over, either to reinforce the city of New York itself or be redeployed north. And the day after the British evacuated Boston, several regiments, including Colonel Bond's 25th Continental Regiment, headed out. The letter with Colonel Bond's orders from General Horatio Gates is actually addressed to our old friend Colonel John Stark of New Hampshire, who has been stationed next door to Malden here in Medford. Now, Colonel Stark is addressed as the commander of both his regiment and Bond's, which is interesting because Colonel Stark's status as a brigade commander and his subsequent lack of promotion to brigadier general will be a major storyline for the next couple years of the war, particularly around the events of the Battle of Saratoga. In Stark's orders, it details the exact route Stark and Bond were to take to get to New York. Day 1, they were to march from Cambridge to Framingham. Day 2, Framingham to Sutton. Day 3, Sutton to Dudley. Day 4, Dudley to Mortlake, Connecticut. And on Day 5, march from Mortlake to Norwich, Connecticut, for a total journey of 97 miles, from where they would board ships for New York. Mortlake, Connecticut, by the way, is today Brooklyn, Connecticut. That 5-day journey to Norwich would today take less than 2 hours, and driving straight from Malden to Manhattan takes less than 5 hours. Colonel Bond's wife, Lucy Bond, was born Lucy Brown in Watertown, Massachusetts in 1734, and had married William Bond when she was 23 years old. Over the next 18 years, she had 10 children. Lucy was 4 months pregnant with her youngest child when the Revolution began. Colonel William Bond was not, however, without family on this expedition. Serving in his regiment was his 20-year-old nephew, Leonard Bond, who, according to the Watertown Historical Society and Watertown historian Maud DeLee Hodges, was the first Watertown Minuteman to report for duty during the Lexington Alarm. Also with Colonel Bond was his son Henry, who in January had celebrated his 14th birthday. Now I know what you're thinking. What does this guy from Watertown have to do with Malden? The problem is, the majority of the folks who fought in the American Revolution don't have surviving diaries or accounts, and most veterans of the war only have a short paragraph cataloging the few times their names appear in records like muster rolls. And because of their managerial responsibilities, colonels produced larger paper trails than corporals. So if you want to know what any specific soldier was doing 250 years ago, oftentimes the best and only place to start is to find their regiment and then trace the steps and find the accounts of their commanding officers. On a more human note, Colonel Bond relates that he was distressed to learn from a family friend that Lucy hadn't received any letters from him, despite the fact that he had sent 3 letters since leaving Cambridge. That means that the letter he wrote 250 years ago today was his 4th letter to his wife he'd written in the last month, all while marching and sailing from Boston to New York in the middle of a war with the greatest superpower on Earth. The day after writing this letter, 250 years ago tomorrow, Colonel Bond, Captain Naylor Hatch, and the other men of Malden under his command set sail for Albany to assist in the stalled invasion of Canada. General Philip Schuyler reported to General Washington that Colonel Bond's regiment arrived at Fort George, 60 miles north of Albany, on the evening of May 2nd. In 6 weeks, the men of Malden and the 25th Continental Regiment have marched and sailed well over 400 miles. But what will they find as they head farther and farther north? Will soldiers from Malden attack Quebec? Or will the British counterattack and keep us in New York? Does everyone make it home? See you soon.